The life of a medieval jester, at first glance, might seem like an endless parade of laughter, outlandish costumes, and juggling before a crowd of drunken nobles. The image that comes to mind is a fellow prancing in a garish, brightly colored outfit, cracking bawdy jokes while dodging scraps of a banquet hurled by some knight across the hall. But, as often happens with romantic notions of the Middle Ages, the reality was far more complex and not always so amusing. Being a jester wasn't just about clowning around to earn a crust. It was a trade that blended wit, risk, humiliation, and, in the best cases, surprising influence in the intrigues of the court. Let's unravel what the life of these characters was really like, because it wasn't all jokes, and sometimes the jester himself was the punchline. First, we need to understand what a jester was in the medieval context. The word jester comes from the French bouffon, which in turn derives from the Italian buffoni, roughly meaning one who puffs, or someone who inflates themselves and makes a fool of themselves. But not all jesters were the same. In the Middle Ages, the term could refer to a variety of entertainers, from minstrels who sang and played instruments, to acrobats, contortionists, and, of course, the classic court clowns we associate with the archetype. Some were itinerant performers traveling from village to village, while others, the luckier ones or not, secured a permanent post in the court of a feudal lord, a bishop, or even a king. Here, we'll focus on these court jesters, as their lives were a microcosm of contradictions. They could be the king's favorite one day and dodging a whip the next for a poorly received jest. Let's start with the setting. Picture a medieval banquet hall, long tables laden with food, often half-rotten, as refrigeration wasn't exactly a medieval forte. Nobles shouting, dogs scrapping over bones under the tables, and a fire crackling in the center. The jester entered this chaos dressed in a costume that was half work of art, half walking mockery. Jesters' outfits were typically vibrant, with bells sewn onto the edges that jingled with every move. Why bells? Because their constant chime reminded everyone that here came the man whose very existence was a joke. Sometimes they wore pointed caps with donkey ears or horns, because subtlety wasn't exactly a hallmark of medieval fashion. But make no mistake, that costume wasn't just for laughs. It was a clear sign of their status, or rather, their lack thereof. The jester was, in many ways, the lord's property, someone who existed solely to entertain. Now, how did someone become a jester? It wasn't exactly a career you picked at a medieval job fair. Many jesters were marginalized from the start. In some cases, they were individuals with physical or mental disabilities that made them peculiar in the eyes of medieval society. A dwarf, a hunchback, or someone with a condition we'd now diagnose with clinical precision might end up in a court because their appearance or behavior was deemed amusing. The Middle Ages wasn't a model of sensitivity. People laughed at what they didn't understand, and feudal lords were no exception. Other jesters, however, were clever individuals, natural actors, or talented musicians who saw the trade as a way to survive in a world where options for the poor were limited. Toil in the fields until an early death or take a chance as a noble's clown. Once in the court, the jester had to earn their keep, and it wasn't as simple as telling a few ribald jokes. Their repertoire included juggling, acrobatics, songs, dances, and, of course, jests. But these weren't the knock-knock jokes of today. A good jester needed wit as sharp as a dagger, because their humor often skirted the edge of danger. They were expected to be social commentators, able to voice uncomfortable truths no one else dared utter. For instance, a jester might mock a noble's greed or a court lady's infidelity, always wrapped in a joke that, hopefully, softened the blow. But the line between funny and offensive was thinner than a spider's thread. A bad joke could cost a jester a beating, banishment, or, in extreme cases, much worse. A famous example is Triboulet, the jester of Francis I of France. Triboulet was known for his sharp tongue and ability to make the king laugh, but one day he went too far. He made a lewd remark about the queen, and Francis, in no mood for it, ordered his execution. According to legend, the king, in a moment of clemency, allowed Triboulet to choose his manner of death. True to form, Triboulet replied, "I'd prefer to die of old age." Impressed by the response, Francis spared him, but the anecdote shows how precarious the role was. The jester lived in a constant balancing act between being useful and being expendable.
Let's talk about living conditions.
If you think being a jester meant living like a noble, with a private chamber and daily feasts, think again. While some jesters in major courts might have had a modicum of stability, a pallet in a castle corner, leftover food, and maybe some new clothes, most lived in precarious conditions. In smaller courts, a jester might be treated little better than a dog. They slept in kitchens, stables, or any corner where they wouldn't be in the way. Their pay, if any, was often in kind. Food, old clothes, or, at best, a few coins. And while some jesters managed to amass some wealth, like Will Sommers, Henry VIII's jester, who acquired properties, this was the exception, not the rule. Moreover, the jester had no days off. If the Lord wanted entertainment at 3 in the morning because he couldn't sleep, the jester had to get up, put on their bells, and perform. And it wasn't just at banquets. Jesters often accompanied their lords on trips, hunts, or even to war, because a stressed noble needed a laugh even in the middle of a battlefield. Imagine trying to crack a joke about a clumsy knight while dodging arrows. It wasn't a job for just anyone. But it wasn't all suffering. Talented jesters could carve out a special place in the court. Some became confidants of their lords, informal advisors who used humor to offer counsel others wouldn't dare. For example, a jester might warn the king about a corrupt advisor by cloaking the critique in an absurd fable. This ability to navigate court intrigues gave them a peculiar, albeit fragile, power. A clever jester knew their influence depended on the lord's goodwill, and that goodwill could vanish on a bad day. Another fascinating aspect is the jester's role in medieval culture. In a deeply religious society where the church dictated much of the moral code, the jester was a kind of pressure valve. The Middle Ages wasn't exactly a laugh fest. With plagues, wars, and the constant threat of death from a minor infection, people needed something to ease the tension. The jester, with their ability to mock both the sacred and the profane, provided that relief. But this also put them in a dangerous position. Mocking the church or a bishop could be seen as heresy, and while jesters often had some license for their jests, that license had limits. More than one jester got into trouble for a quip about an overly fat cleric or a monk too friendly with nuns. Then there was the issue of competition. In a large court, you weren't the only one entertaining the Lord. There were musicians, poets, minstrels, and other jesters, all vying for the patron's attention. If your joke didn't land or your juggling didn't impress, you could be quickly replaced by someone wittier. This forced jesters to be creative and constantly refresh their repertoire. Some even developed unique skills, like mimicking voices, performing fire tricks, or telling epic tales with a comedic twist. But this constant pressure could be exhausting. Imagine having to be funny every day, even when your wife left you, your dog died, and the bread you ate that morning is giving you cramps. One point we can't overlook is the relationship between the jester and the audience. While the Lord was the primary target, the jester also had to win over the rest of the court: knights, ladies, servants. This wasn't easy, as each group had its own tastes and sensitivities. A joke that made drunken knights roar could offend a pious lady, and a clever political quip might fall flat if the audience was more interested in seeing the jester fall on their face. The jester had to be a master of improvisation, reading the room and adjusting their act accordingly. There was also a darker side to the jester's life that's rarely mentioned: constant humiliation. While some jesters were respected for their wit, many were the butt of jokes and abuse. Nobles might use the jester as a punching bag, figuratively or literally. It wasn't uncommon for a jester to take a hit or an insult as part of the show. And while some jesters could fire back with a biting remark, others had to swallow their pride and carry on. This power dynamic was a constant reminder of their place in the hierarchy. No matter how much they made others laugh, they were never equals. Psychologically, being a jester must have been a roller coaster. On one hand, there was the thrill of being the center of attention, making a room full of powerful people laugh. On the other, there was the uncertainty of not knowing if your next joke would earn a coin or a punishment. Plus, many jesters had to deal with the stigma of their profession. In a society obsessed with honor and status, being a jester was to be less than nothing. Even the lowliest servants could look down on the jester, because at least they didn't have to wear a belled cap to earn a living. But it wasn't all misery. In more enlightened courts, like those of the early Renaissance, some jesters transcended their role. Take Stanzik, the jester of several Polish kings in the 16th century. Stanzik was known not only for his humor, but also for his wisdom. In stories, he appears as a melancholic figure who used his wit to reflect on Poland's fate. In a famous 19th century painting, he's depicted sitting alone, with a look of profound sadness, while the court celebrates behind him. Though this image is a romanticized ideal, it reflects a truth. Jesters often saw and understood more than they let on. Another example is Schicket, the jester of Henry III of France. Schicket didn't just make people laugh. He also served as a spy and messenger for the king. His jester status allowed him to move freely through the court and overhear conversations others couldn't. In this sense, some jesters were more than entertainers. They were key players in the political game, using their apparent insignificance as a cloak of invisibility. Let's also talk about the physical demands of the trade. Being a jester wasn't just about wit, it required considerable physical endurance. Juggling, acrobatics, or dancing for hours wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Add to that the long hours, travel, and the unsanitary conditions of the era, and it's no wonder many jesters died young. Disease was a constant risk, and a sick jester wasn't exactly useful. If you couldn't perform, you could be discarded like an old horse. As for their personal lives, we know very little. Historical records rarely mention whether jesters had families, friends, or dreams beyond their work. Many likely led solitary lives, especially those traveling from court to court. In fixed courts, some jesters might form bonds with other servants or even nobles, but always with the invisible barrier of their status. Imagine trying to court someone while wearing a belled costume. Not exactly the stuff of romantic dreams. A curious detail is that some jesters were women, though they were far less common. Female jesters, like Mathurin in the French court, faced an additional challenge, navigating a male-dominated world where their presence was already seen as odd. Mathurin, for instance, was known for her biting wit and ability to disguise herself as a man to spy for the king. But, like her male counterparts, she lived in a precarious balance between favor and danger. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, the jester's role began to shift. With the Renaissance, the idea of the universal man and the rise of the arts started to displace the traditional jester. Nobles began to prefer more refined poets, musicians, and playwrights. Yet the jester's spirit didn't vanish entirely. It transformed into the comedians, actors, and satirists of later eras. Shakespeare, for example, filled his plays with characters who were essentially jesters. The Fool in King Lear or Fest in Twelfth Night show how the jester's wit remained valued, but now in a more theatrical context. So, what was the life of a medieval jester really like? It was a job that required a unique blend of talent, courage, and resignation. It was being the center of attention and the lowest in the hierarchy at the same time. It was making others laugh while often carrying your own sadness. Jesters weren't just clowns. They were mirrors of society, reflecting its flaws and absurdities with a forced smile. And though they sometimes achieved a moment of glory, a perfect jest that made the whole court roar, they also lived knowing their next joke could be their last. It wasn't all jests, but deep down, the jester knew their life was the greatest joke of all.